God exist?
Does God exist? That's another big one.
There is something rather than nothing. Does that imply a creator? For centuries,
It could. We were talking about this earlier. You know, if thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas would make this exact argument that if all of observable reality is only contingent, and kind of what that Leibniz argument about how there must exist therefore some necessary being, and then there's arguments as to what would a necessary being have to look like, and Aquinas goes the route of saying it would be the essence of being itself, which would ultimately be God. That would be the divine essence. And there's various arguments and debates. You might ask, like, why does this have to therefore be like an intentional mind? But there's really interesting arguments, and things like law of proportionate causality and things as to why even mental properties are arguably more fundamental. It's, again, maybe a topic for another video, but this is exactly what we were talking a little bit about earlier.
This question has fueled debate between philosophers, theologians, and scientists alike.
Yep.
The cosmological argument, famously put forth by Aquinas, asserts that everything in existence must have a cause.
Okay. It's a little reductive. So a cosmological argument isn't like one argument. It's actually a collection of arguments. It's a type of argument. A cosmological argument is generally a type of argument that tries to reason from the cosmos, from existence, the existence of nature, to the existence of God. And this can take many different forms. Aquinas does have an argument from causation. It's his second way. He has his famous 5 ways. They're called 5 ways to God. There are these 5 arguments he puts out in Summa Theologia. But, and that's the second way, is his argument from efficient causation, which is kind of, a little more in line with this modern way of thinking about causation of like a line of dominoes falling. But that's not even really what probably Aquinas is most well known for. He's probably more well known for his first way, which is more of an Aristotelian argument that has to deal with motion and change. And the fact that the fact that change occurs implies there must be an infinite source of immutable or unchanging actuality in order to bring all other things into motion. But this couldn't be logically possible unless the first prime mover were itself unmovable or without motion. And motion means change. Today, we often use a word like motion interchangeably with like locomotion, moving, which would be change between locations, as the name implies. But that's just one kind of motion. Motion really just means all forms of change, including like becoming and perishing and whatnot. But basically, Aquinas also has his own contingency argument. We were talking about that with Leibniz. Aquinas' third way is a contingency argument. So I feel like this explanation is a little reductive. Like, you can just reduce Aquinas down to like some, what's the first cause of everything? It's far more sophisticated than that. And again, I don't think you can call Aquinas' second way the cosmological argument, when a cosmological argument is really just a type of argument. But anyway, let's continue.
Trace those causes back far enough, and there must be an uncaused first cause, something that exists by necessity rather than contingency.
Again, this is actually mixing up different arguments, right? So this is kind of mixing up Aquinas' second and third ways. It's taking his argument from efficient causation and sort of conflating it with his argument from necessity and contingency. I highly recommend anybody look up the 5 ways. It's actually none of them are particularly lengthy. They're actually relatively concise arguments. But I'd recommend looking them up to really engage with, this influential ways of reasoning about natural theology. Natural theology is theology. So generally, theology is broken up into natural theology and revealed theology. Revealed theology would refer to theological truths that are revealed in some way. So this means this is presupposing you believe in some form of scripture, like the Bible, as containing theological truth that's been revealed intentionally to human beings. Natural theology is a study of theological truth as it's contained within nature, right? So it's the idea that you don't have to read the Bible or ever be exposed to scripture in order to know certain theological truths like God exists or God is infinitely good or whatever, because these things can be reasoned to from the observable natural world. And Aquinas is hugely influential on this idea of natural theology. I just recommend people look it up, give it a read. Aquinas' Five Ways. There's a contemporary philosopher named Ed Fraser who has a great book, Five Proofs for God, and who I think makes this stuff a lot more approachable. But just some recommended reading for my viewers.
Often identified as God. The teleological argument, or the watchmaker analogy, suggests that the
So this is Aquinas' fifth way. Aquinas has his own teleological argument, but it's far more sophisticated than a simple watchmaker argument. And again, I think we're going to see some things being conflated and oversimplified here, because Aquinas' fifth way more has to do with the directedness of objects in nature and the fact that objects even have a nature. Nature in an Aristotelian sense. Aristotle defines nature as an internal principle of motion. So remember, motion is change. So there are changes that can be inflicted upon something from an external source, right? Like if I light a piece of paper on fire and the paper combusts, its combustion into ash, that was a change that was sort of inflicted upon it from the outside, right? From forces outside of it. But in nature is a change that occurs from within. So something like, say, an acorn growing into a tree. The acorn growing into the tree, that change that occurred, where the acorn unfolded and grew into a whole tree, that wasn't inflicted upon it by outside sources. That was a source of change that came from within it, right? And so Aquinas' fifth way has to do with that. The fact that things have a natural motion, that they move towards things by their own nature. And he attempts to reason to God's existence from that. That's really the OG teleological argument, right? And the idea is the teleology kind of, I'm bringing in some modern terms here, but that it sort of correlates to intentionality, to the way the mind works. The mind points towards things, or the mind thoughts are about things, right? So the mind points in a certain direction. And there is a strong kind of relationship between the way the mind works in that way. The mind has a directedness about it, and the fact that natural objects have a directedness about them. So again, teleological argument's actually much more sophisticated than this. Where this language is coming from is more modern. It's from like the 19th century. I'm trying to blank on the guy's name, but he famously beefed with Charles Darwin. But he kind of proposed this. He called it teleological argument, but it was this idea of a watchmaker. Like if you found a sophisticated high-end watch, wristwatch on the beach, if you just stumbled across it and you held it up and looked at it, you would just kind of intuitively know it was designed by a watchmaker, just because of how intricate it is and how moving towards it's all these many parts organized together and ordered, moving towards a certain end, performing a certain function. And likewise, he tries to reason that therefore you can look to nature and see how nature is so precisely ordered, and reason towards it must be designed as well, right? So that's a more modern way of going about things like this. But I just think it's a bit erroneous to conflate the teleological argument with that alone, when in fact it has a much longer history and is much more metaphysically sophisticated than that. But I've kind of gone on enough of a tangent here. Let's continue.
Universe's complexity and order hint at intelligent design. Even modern physics, with its precise fundamental constants, has led some scientists to believe the universe is fine-tuned for life, suggesting a creator. But skeptics argue that science provides natural explanations.
That is true.
Evolution explains the diversity of life.
That is true. It is very interesting history behind it. I keep drawing blanks on important names. It's one of those tip of your tongue things, but there's a famous scientist who converted well, I don't even know if he converted to a specific religion, but he at least came to believe in God. Just purely based off of his research into physics. And it is kind of remarkable just how precisely fine-tuned the universe is in a way that allows for life to be hospitable, or in a way that makes it hospitable to life being developed. There's just so many variables in the laws of nature that if they were just a little bit different or a little bit off, you couldn't have stars and planets and all the things needed to give rise to life, let alone intelligent life. It is pretty remarkable, and that's, again, this is getting more in a modern version of what people call a teleological argument. But again, I just want to highlight that's a more modern argument That is not really what a teleological argument is traditionally if we go back to a thinker like Aquinas. But let's continue.
Without divine intervention. The problem of evil challenges the notion of an all-powerful, all-good God. If he is good and sentient, why allow suffering?
Well,
some argue that belief in God is a product of human psychology,
I'll let him finish first.
a way to find meaning in a chaotic world. The debate continues.
All right, no, he's right. Okay, so yeah, that's the problem of evil, or really the problem of suffering. You know, if God is infinitely powerful, infinitely knowledgeable, and infinitely good, then why does there exist all this suffering and pain and things we tend to define as bad? Is he just simply unaware that there's all this pain and suffering going on? Well, then he's not all-knowing. Is it he's aware there's all this suffering going on, but he's just not able to stop it? Well, then he's not all-powerful. Is it that he's aware there's all this suffering going on and he's fully capable of stopping it, but he just chooses not to? Well, then he must not be all good. That's a classic problem of evil. The problem with that argument is it's kind of presupposing an additional hidden fourth premise along the lines of, and there is no morally justifiable reason for allowing a certain amount of pain and suffering to exist. So in other words, the idea is, and there are things called theodicies. Theodicies are attempts at giving an explanation as to why it may be ultimately good for an all-good, all-powerful God to allow some amount of pain and suffering to exist. So this would include things like free will is a common argument. The idea is, if you could live in Orwell's 1984, if you could live in this society where everything and every aspect of your life is strictly controlled, but as a result of that, there were no crime, there was no drunk driving and drunk driving related accidents, there was no drug use and people overdosing, there was no violent crime and people victims of crime. I mean, if you think about it, the world of Orwell's 1984, as dystopic as we think of it, it is a world with effectively like zero crime rate and zero drug addiction and there's all these social ills that a world like that completely gets rid of. But it's at the cost of having every aspect of your life tightly controlled by the government. And so would you rather live in that world? Or would you rather live in a world where you have freedom, but as a consequence of that freedom, that means you have the freedom to choose to do stupid and bad things, including drugs and drunk driving and, you know, all these things that can get you killed or get someone else killed or hurt? You know, which would you prefer? And most people overwhelmingly would choose the second option, right? They'd say, I'd rather suffer some of the social ills and pain and suffering that comes with being free, but still be free to make those choices, than have no freedom, you know, to then get rid of all those social ills, but at the cost of no freedom, right? So that's just meant as an example to show how there can be a reason why allowing a certain amount of pain and suffering can sometimes be the better option, right? That there's something that makes it more of a good world to live in by having a certain amount of pain and suffering. There's also, you know, there's other theodicies. It's not just free will, because free will doesn't really explain, but well, then why do people get horrible diseases? Why do kids die of cancer and, you know, natural disasters happen? But there's other arguments, you know, that there are certain goods and virtues that can only be cultivated in the face of adversity and pain and suffering. So, for example, the virtue of courage can only occur when you're facing fear and danger, right? The virtue of things like being merciful and kind, like some of the aspects of mercy can only occur when you've first been wronged, right? That there are goods that arise from first suffering some amount of pain and suffering. So there's different theodicies, different explanations for this, but there's lots of different ways in which there's lots of different ways in arguments made as to why it could be the case that you could have an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God who also simultaneously has some legitimately good reason for allowing a certain amount of pain and suffering to exist. So that's kind of the problem with the this problem of evil or problem of suffering argument. That would be the main response to it. But let's continue.
Science hasn't proven God's existence, but it hasn't disproven it either. Personally, I'm agnostic. I don't know.
Well, it's debatable whether that's a question science could ever prove. I mean, it's arguably not really a scientific question because science investigates natural phenomena of physical objects in the observable world, but God would necessarily be supernatural, or that is literally above nature, and therefore not something that's investigated in that same manner. I would actually recommend my video on what is God. I talk about some of this. It might be helpful.
And I don't think anyone does or ever will. Some see God as
Well, okay, that's another problem is with the whole agnostic thing. I'm sorry to keep pausing a lot. I just feel like this guy's kind of tripping up on some terminology here. Agnostic would mean kind of what he said, right? You just don't know, right? That's your position. I just don't know whether God exists or does not exist. And you can be agnostic towards any belief. You know, I don't know whether it's true the sky is blue or whether it's false the sky is blue. But he's saying, I don't think anyone ever knows or ever could know. Well, that's a different position. That's more of a position of skepticism, right? Because knowledge is justified true belief. So if it happened to be the case that God existed and somebody believed it was true that God existed and they had some kind of good reason for believing it, various arguments, some of which you talked about earlier, they would have knowledge that God existed. Or if it's the case that God didn't exist and somebody believed it's true that God does not exist and they had, various reasons, rational accounts as to why they are atheist like that, they would have knowledge that God does not exist. You don't need to have absolute certainty to have knowledge. And I noticed a lot of times when people say things like this, like, well, I'm an agnostic, but then they'll take that a step further to some form of radical skepticism and saying that means I don't think anybody knows whether God exists. I think they're conflating knowledge with absolute certainty. You don't have to be certain of something to have knowledge of it. It just needs to be the case that belief you have knowledge of is true and you have justification for it. You have some good reason for believing it. And as long as that's the case, so it's really just a question of does God exist or not? Because if he does, then yes, I suppose there are some people who just believe God exists without any real reason other than that's how I was raised. They, I guess, wouldn't have knowledge. But as long as you have some kind of good reasoning behind why you believe God exists, if it's true, then you have knowledge God exists. And the same applies the opposite direction. If you don't believe God exists and you have some kind of good reasoning behind believing that, as long as it's the case that God does not exist, you have knowledge that God does not exist. Again, a lot of people kind of conflate knowledge with absolute certainty, and I think that's what this guy's doing a little bit here.
Is the answer to existence. Others see no need for one. In the end, it might be a question we're simply not meant to answer.
If God existed, I think that is a question that's meant to be answered. I think that God would want human beings to use their reason to reason to a relationship with him. So I don't know if I agree with that last statement. Or if God doesn't exist, that would be a hugely important belief, I think, for human beings to know. So I don't think I agree that it's a belief we're not meant to answer.
If you like my philosophical content and wish to see more of it, help get my channel off the ground by remembering to like, share, comment, and subscribe.